Welcome. Look around. 2023 was the year that AI burst from the pages of sci-fi novels and into our everyday reality. Some people are very excited, others predict a dark future with Skynet and Terminator-like androids threatening our very existence. But consider this. Today, people in their 20s, 30s know more about Kim Kardashian than they do about the Speaker of the House of Congress. You see, people are worried about AI and will it get rid of us, but I want you to just stop and consider that AI is not human and it gets all of its information from humans. If we fail to behave like a species who actually cares about each other, aren't we giving AI everything it needs to fulfill our darkest nightmares? Whether we like it or not, we live in a world where fame and power have become more important than kindness, and people will climb over each other to get there. But why? And at what cost? This is the superstar paradox, and we will dive into that quandary with our esteemed guest, Keren Eldad, very shortly. Welcome to another episode of the Dov Baron Show. For the past 16 years, we've aspired to bring you the very best in outstanding thought leaders and deep thinkers as our guests. That's why we've constantly evolved the show. As you may know, we used to be two shows, the Leadership and Loyalty Podcast and Curiosity Bites. We brought the two shows together to give you the very best of both worlds. Now you get to step into the world's heartbeat with the Dov Baron Show, where you come for the stories and you stay for the learning. We're excited to have you as part of our community, so please hit that subscribe button. It really does make a big difference, and we do sincerely appreciate it. Every episode offers a tantalizing taste of the delicious thoughts and wisdom of global leaders, deep thinkers, entertainers, and a spectrum of the most captivating minds, from astronauts soaring the cosmos to philosophers plumbing the soul's depth. Ready for an odyssey? This is more than a podcast. It's your passport to unparalleled insights. This week, our guest of honor is Keren Eldad. Keren is an executive coach for people who are already very successful, but want to feel as successful on the inside as they actually look on the outside. She held multiple C-suite positions for decades, and she did so at the expense of her own happiness, self-knowledge, and personal life, having served more than 24 blue-chip brands, including Estée Lauder, LVMH, Deutsche Bank, Nike, and global hedge funds and startups, and over 1,000 professionals within those organizations. Keren knows how frustrating it is to feel aimless, unhappy, and stuck while looking like a superstar. Having come out on the other side after taking an inner journey that collapsed the facade, she now is a coach who rolls up her sleeves and goes in with any struggling superstar to help them reach clarity, joy, meaning, and impact that they've been looking for in their lives. Ladies and gentlemen, turn up the volume and help me to welcome Keren Eldad. Hey, Keren, welcome.
Hey, Dov. It's so much fun to be here with you. Finally.
It took a while.
It did. Yeah, you
does take a while.
know that. So it's really, really exciting for me to be here. It's a pinch me moment.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. I really enjoyed our previous call. I love having the chats with people before they ever become a guest and finding out if there's a fit. And there was such simpatico between the two of us. And part of that comes from the fact that you and I both know that humans, we teach what we need to learn. We teach what we need to learn, but often we don't bother to learn it. And the challenge with that for me, looking into the world, is that every man and his dog and every woman and her cat, and now they're a coach. And I don't usually have coaches on as guests. And be very clear about that for reasons that go beyond the scope of what I can talk about here. However, you're not the usual fare. Where do you believe traditional coach...
Well, that's a great question to start with. The first thing I will say is that the industry of coaching is the first place I enjoy criticizing. It's a wild, wild west right now. It's definitely a snake oil salesman's universe. And I understand why you wouldn't want every other coach out there on this program. I have met, believe it or not, 28-year-old coaches, and that is one astounding oxymoron for me. The first way in which I diverge with the industry is I actually do see that there's a lack of accreditation, there's a lack of gravitas, and there's a real lack of sincerity in the coaching universe. The second way with which I diverge from traditional coaching is what's known as the wiser questioning model or the open-ended questioning model, which really is just a replica of therapy. Let's just ask you some questions, allow you to lead the way, and in an anti-didactic fashion, hope that we end up somewhere coherent. But the world of coaching to me is really about taking a person from A to Z. This is a directed, goal-oriented process at the end of which we leave you at the foot of a mountain with all the wisdom that you could absorb from us. So you are going to be looking for, first and foremost, real experience, not just proper accreditation, a real experience in the journey, and secondly, a didactic process that is finite. And in both cases, I'd like to say you and I check those boxes. And hopefully, in that sense, are very distinct from other coaches.
I personally have a great dislike of the term. When anybody calls me a coach, I feel bleh by it. It kind of puts me off. Because, as you said, I think you can be 15 years old and learn to coach. And you can learn that process. But what are you bringing to it beyond the by script coaching? Having had experience, as you said, the gravitas to have that experience. And as I said just a moment ago, we teach what we need to learn. If we haven't walked through that path, and I talked about you having gone through those things. So you, like myself, are an immigrant coming to America in some way, up-level your life. When did you realize that you were pursuing this superstar paradox yourself?
Oh, it was awesome. I had the classic sobbing on the kitchen floor moment that so many people talk about. I was on the bathroom floor, but it doesn't matter. Tiles,
The living room. So,
yeah. We all heard that. We all remember the dark night of the soul.
exactly.
Where you have this big, just what does it all mean? And I was actually suicidal. And technically, the great irony, of course, was that I had accomplished everything I'd set out to accomplish, which was get the right degrees from the right schools, find the linear path to a C-suite position, marry the right kind of man, and look fantastic on Instagram. And all of these were just check, 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 check. And I was absolutely miserable in my life, just miserable. It was completely empty. The marriage was a sham. It was abusive. I was sleeping in the library of our home. The job was kind of okay, Dov. I was good at it. I just really didn't like it, and it didn't light me up or anywhere near that. Looking good on Instagram means not eating very much, and I was constantly depriving myself of just basic things that I enjoy doing and really enjoy being. And so all of these keeping up appearances and pretenses had cost me essentially making authentic decisions and authentic choices for my life. And this is where, after that big crash, I decided to burn it all to the ground and redo it, start over. And it took years, but just like a reconstruction physically, a reconstruction spiritually will ultimately lead you to something that really you've never seen before. Quite magnificent.
Walk us into that moment, though, because when people talk to me about my fall, they talk about the literal fall that I fell off a mountain. And I always say, yeah, that wasn't the fall. That was the catalytic moment, but it wasn't the actual where I had to break down and look at what was going on. You're sleeping in the library in a marriage that looks good, living in a house that looks nice, and having a career that looks successful. What was that turning point that got you onto the bathroom floor where you're going, I can't do this anymore?
Yeah. Well, like you, I actually did suffer a physical fall, but you're right. I don't attribute that to the eventual collapse. You just wrote a really amazing post that I loved. I loved every word of, Dov. Toxic tolerance.
Yes.
Toxic tolerance is that state in which we have so gotten used to maintaining the garbage that we don't even notice that it's garbage anymore. It's, of course, the zone of comfort, right?
Yep.
And the comfort zone becomes very, very uncomfortable in one of two ways. Either you have the immense wisdom to say, I'm not happy, which I think happens to maybe 1% of people, or for 99%, something traumatic does happen. In my case, there was a robbery. And the robbery revealed that we didn't have insurance because my husband didn't pay for insurance, and that he hadn't done several other things correctly, and a whole bunch of other things just came to light where I couldn't look away anymore. I couldn't pretend that this was okay and we could just maintain this anymore. And that's when the systems start collapsing one by one. Now, many people will say, yes, it was the financial downturn, the financial fall that created this awakening, but it really wasn't. It was a very long period of numbness that had to be examined because I was reaching a point of no return. It was becoming too aggressive to ignore anymore.
So let me ask you, because this is an important question for anybody listening, watching us right now, is you said it was a long time. I know it was a long time for me. I fell in June. My life up until that moment, I would have said was pretty great, and I'm on top of it. And 9 months later, it hits me, that moment on the floor. Why do you think for you, it took you however long it took you? Because you said there was a long period of numbness.
Arrogant. I really think I have always had this sense of I got this. And this is what I have in common with superstars or overachievers. I can handle this. This is what it's supposed to be. Clearly, I have not made a mistake. How could I possibly make a mistake? What kind of person looks inward anyway? I really had a disdain for anyone who was interested in therapy, self-exploration, and of course, self-help, which was absolutely unacceptable to the academic biases I carried. My parents are immigrants. They absolutely don't understand the universe of looking inward to this day, by the way. So it really just wasn't an option. It was just get yourself together. Clearly, if something is wrong, it just requires more work. And that essentially creates a doubling down on the zone of toxic tolerance instead of what is required, which is a complete withdrawal. Remove yourself from the situation so that you can actually understand what's happening.
I fully understand and I agree with you entirely. But the challenge is, I believe, and I'd want to hear from you, it's that even if I get it, so I get exactly what you're saying, the doubling down. I've just not worked hard enough. I can work harder. You can't keep me down. I'm going to keep going. I'm a bull. I'll go through the wall. I will do whatever it takes. We've all had that mentality. And I used to think it was that level of arrogance that was in my way. And then I realized what was really in my way was my addiction to my identity as that.
Of course.
If I look in, and I had already done, so just to be clear, I'd already done 15 years of work. I'd already been looking in for 15 years. But looking deeply in, going into the shadow, that was a whole different gig. And so it was beyond the identity of I've already got all my poo in a pile. So it was that identity piece. When did you realize it was your actual identity that was threatened?
So I really resonated with one segment of your book, Fiercely Loyal, which was when you meet the therapist and she basically shuts you up and says, stop overtaking the session. I can see what you're doing. That's a pattern that we continue, but that's also where the identity really comes through and you start to understand how deep the pattern is to start to let go of. That's also why for those of us who are in this pattern, it actually takes a process of grief to even begin to achieve some form of clarity, because you're essentially killing a former self in order to get here. You have to slay that identity and let them go down with the ship for you to rebuild. And I think that moment for me was I could really start seeing it when I started to sign up for the self-help seminars, for the Tony Robbins and for the Kabbalah classes and for whatever I was interested in at the time, just looking for answers and noticing little by little how difficult time I was having with listening to other people, how hard it was for me to empathize with other people when I thought of myself as such a lovely person. And it turns out I really wasn't. I was a very rigid thinker. And through that, I started to examine myself more and more and more. And that just allowed more and more space to open up. And it was mainly through one question, Dov, that I kept asking myself, which is, how's that working out? Really, like I came to a moment where I just admitted that everything I had done up until this point had gotten me nothing but garbage. It wasn't worth anything. Not the wardrobe, not the husband, not the fancy house. None of it was worth anything.
So you and I hope that in sharing our stories a little bit here, that it becomes reflective for people and they have a sense of maybe seeing themselves in some of this. But from your point of view, what makes these overachievers so really, truly susceptible to completely missing the target? They are so focused and so goal-oriented that they're masterful at hitting the targets, yet they completely miss the target in these realms.
Well, the answer is within the question. It's the relentless pursuit of those targets when you have never examined the targets or what they're worth to you. The identity becomes completely obsessed with achieving target. That's what the identity is obsessed with. Then it becomes very averse to losing that. In other words, we have a cost of opportunity problem. If I do decide to actually change my life, I'm going to lose everything that I've built so far, right? And the problem is you've never asked yourself properly whether what you're about to lose is worth anything. So the relentless pursuit of success, as you define it, and in most cases for overachievers, it is money, it is financial reward, it is fame or status. Whether you slice it any worth way, no, I'm making an impact. No, you're not. You're obsessed with being seen or recognized. And when you understand that those are worth nothing, in other words, they will never give the fulfillment they promise, which you will start to identify because you're sort of a bottomless pit. Like you're asking yourself, when is enough when it comes to money? That's when you know that you're certainly at a tipping point. This is why overachievers are far, far more susceptible to depression, to anxiety. And we know this, of course, from studies, but also they're much more susceptible to invulnerability, which will keep them in patterns that are chaotic for a very long portion of their lives.
Can you walk us through a story and experience? I'm not asking you, obviously, to name names unless it's okay, of somebody you have worked with, dealt with, who is fixed into that mentality. Because as I said, I want people to be clear here. We are not saying this is easy. We're not saying that for a second. And so if you're thinking, I could never do this, well, I could never do this, and Keren could never do this, and everybody I've ever worked with could never do this, but they do, and their lives are much better. But you might be sort of teetering on the edge and even secret. Tell us a little bit of an insight, case study of somebody who might have been in that resistant side and feeling the pull, but still like, ooh, I've not given up my identity.
Well, Dov, life has a way of helping us out when we're in that situation. So my favorite stories are the ones that involve not just an epiphany, but a shitstorm that brought to an epiphany. And I've seen enough of those in coaching. In other words, I like to say, if I don't get to you, life will. And that's because you're asking, especially through the process of coaching, becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. One of my favorite stories is a wonderful superstar I was working with for quite some time, who was aware that something was off, but still could not, quote unquote, could not break the patterns that were bringing to this extreme exhaustion, extreme stress, business hardships. They knew intellectually what to do to break free from this, but they still did not think that it applied to them. In other words, they said, if I just keep doing what I'm doing, I'll be fine because I'm also absorbing the lessons, Keren, so I can just balance it out. Unfortunately, you cannot graduate without breaking those patterns. The patterns that drive you to overwhelm, the answering the phone at all hours, the arguing and taking up every single battle, the not addressing your marital issue. And I continue to say, this is a line from Sliding Doors, which is a movie I love from the 90s. Don't worry about it. If you don't want to actually implement any of these things that we've been discussing for months, the universe is going to throw you a nice little problem that you can't weasel your way out. Well, guess what? I was, of course, not wishing this person any harm, but I knew that it would happen. This, just like for you, Dov, just like for me, there's got to be a big wake-up call, right? The end of toxic tolerance is many times at the end of the crash. And in his case, it was a disease. He got sick. He got really, 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 really sick. And after 9 months in the hospital, he woke up. And that was the moment in which he finally was ready to let go of the resistance. First, because life was too precious. And second, I think even more interestingly, because he realized finally that the world continued even when he stopped, which is a breathtaking realization for an overachiever. And from then on, everything has just been truly different.
So you've continued to work with him from there.
Yeah.
Okay. And as you do that, as you examine this, I think there's still this point that I'm trying to have the listener get, which is even if you get it, we talk about this in this way. There will be enough pain eventually to move you forward. That's the rule of life. Whether you choose to move forward or not, that's up to you, but you'll get catalyzed there. And then something will happen and it will be so much better. Like you'll find something, you'll find a seminar with Tony Robbins, or you'll find a therapist, or you'll find something. And then this is the trap. This is the second trap. So the first trap is chasing the accolades. And the second trap is thinking you've found the solution. Because you went to Tony Robbins, or you went to a therapist, blah, 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 or you're like the person you spoke about, is I know all the things now, and you've now turned into this asshole who is constantly telling other people what they should do, but you're not doing any of it.
That's true.
Right? And now you've got another ego level, you've got another level of identity where you're now the wise one, but you're not implementing anything. And then you hit the wall again, and that's the second wall, which is much worse, because it's much worse to know that you hit the wall, got the answers, and you're not doing them. And that becomes a very big, what's wrong with me? Talk to me about that confrontation. Talk to me about, for the person who's listening, because I guarantee you, you and I both know, I've met Tony several times, but I have worked with many people who've taken everything with him. And I'm like, yeah, I'm glad you had the experience, but you need to start at zero.
And that's right, because they built a bigger ego. And I have actually enjoyed his trainings, but you built a bigger ego. I don't actually think that that's the fault of the teacher. I think that that's that interpretation of especially the very achievement-oriented person. This is why the disease analogy was so perfect. And that's because you don't actually have to experience it. You just have to understand that your way up is down. Your way up is to lose everything. Your way up is to drop all identity, including your identity as a healthy person, as a person who does not require any help, as a mortal, as a person who believed that they were not immortal. In other words, whenever you go through something like that, like my crash too, like your crash, we basically lost everything. I had to completely rebuild my identity from zero. That's what allowed me to build a gentler identity, a vulnerable identity, an identity that knew that I was finite, and so is everything else.
But the question still comes, Keren, that I want to ask you, which is, at that moment, I gave it all up. I admitted my vulnerability. I went and did the seminars. I spoke to a coach. I did the things, and it's still not worked. And now you want me to go more into the fire? Talk to me about dealing with that client who's, I can't give up anymore. When you're saying the only way up is down, the only way out is through, I can't go there. Talk to me about that confrontation moment.
That confrontation moment is very, very common, and it does recur. There are people who stay in the seventh circle of hell. They just go around and around and around. I myself was in purgatory for quite some time. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's a very common occurrence, and that's because your ego is union. It's not quitting anytime soon. And so even when you think that you have lost everything, technically speaking, the universe is like, nah, actually, you can still lose a little bit more. The real rock bottom is one that you will feel because it will lose all resistance too. The impulse to climb will soften. You will actually do the opposite of your inclination. To give you an example, and actually that's what my client went through almost identically, when I hit rock bottom was not after the divorce, which was followed by a fire, which was followed by moving onto a friend's sofa, which was followed by the death of my 2 cats. This is in 2 months. The death of the cats was what tipped everything over. And when the cats died, for anyone who has a pet, it's very painful. I didn't do what I usually did, which was try to climb. I stopped everything. Grief brings you to your knees. You can't do anything about it. You must go all the way through to depression. And only then will you find acceptance. And your newfound point will be a bouncy point. It will not be a climbing point anymore. You'll also lose the inclination to tell everyone around you how very wise you are. You'll be in a different state. That is what everybody has to confront. And I do understand, Dov, how hard that is. But you know what's much harder? Staying in purgatory. 10 million times harder.
And you and I fully agree upon that because we've been there.
Yeah.
But it's still, for those who have not been in purgatory for 10,000 years, well, I'll take a bit of purgatory because at least I can wear some gold and diamonds and buy another set of boobs or another penis extension or something that will make me look better in the world.
And that's actually known as the stage of bargaining, in the stage of grief. And that's where most people are stuck.
Yeah.
They're trying to have their cake and eat it too. Yeah. And that's when you know the work isn't done.
It's fascinating. I don't know if you know this about my story, but you know that I fell, and it was 9 months later when I came around. But what happened was I had been taken out on a Saturday night with my buddies on a pretty regular basis. They were trying to sort of cheer me up and bring me back. And I would always fake it, and I was like pretending I was having a good time, and I felt just miserable. And on one particular Saturday night, I came home and I'd had a good night. I'd actually laughed. And I thought, oh, mate, I am coming back. This is good. And that night, I opened the kitchen door and the light from outside lit the floor in front of me, and the kitchen floor was covered in garbage, kitty litter and empty cans. It was disgusting, and it smelled horrible. I went from that moment of little bit of hope and joy to full-blown rage, and I wanted to kill the culprit. Like, it was a rage. It was nothing else, which again is part of grief. And I walked into the living room, and there's the culprit curled up and all comfy on the couch. And I lift my hand to strike. I'm not a violent person. So I stop myself, and instead I scoop up in my arms my cat. And I bring my cat to my chest, and he's cold, and he's dead. He had a distemper attack, and that's why he'd done all that stuff in the kitchen. And I fell to my knees and began to weep at the death of my cat. And I was there for probably no more than a couple of minutes when I realized I'm not crying for the cat. I'm crying for the death of who I was. And that was the moment. It's fascinating that it was this moment of grief gifted to me by my bloody cat, who I didn't particularly like. It wasn't even my cat. I just sort of inherited it. But it was like that cat gifted me the birth into a very dark place of depression, but it was the turning point.
Absolutely. And it was the moment that you realized that you had to let it all go. I love that story. It gave me chills, but it reminds me of the story I like to tell in most of my seminars, which is, of course, the story of Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump. When that storm comes in and you see him screaming at the storm. And when it doesn't kill them, he's a new person.
Yeah.
And that's when Forrest says, I believe that's when Lieutenant Dan made his peace with God.
Yes.
That is the moment. And you're looking for surrender. Unfortunately, there is no going through it without the rage or without the storm. That's one of the things that we can help you do, which is to actually face it. Because most people are in a state of such numbness with that toxic tolerance, they won't even be able to put their finger on what is bothering them. Well, why is it bothering them?
I also think there's not permission to scream at the storm, because I'm not a crazy person. I'm not going to do that. Right?
Or I would be ungrateful if I screamed at all this.
Right.
That's the most common thing I hear.
I don't have the right to complain.
Yeah.
It isn't complaining. People say that to me. I don't have the right to complain. I'm so blessed. And I just want to punch them in the head when they say I'm so blessed. Yeah, you've got a lot, but that doesn't mean you're blessed. It means you have a lot. And yes, you should be grateful, of course. But that's not taking your gratitude away. It's saying what matters more. So
that's right.
We're already at the end of part one of the show. And when I come back in part two, I want to sort of get into the nitty-gritty of where does somebody watching, listening to us who has a sense of this with themselves, what are the practical steps they can take, even if they don't have a way of hiring you or I? And then I also want to talk about where it goes at a company level as we bring it into our organizations. So we're going to come back and have more conversation with Keren in just one click. But before we do, Keren, please tell people where they can find out more about you and all your wonderful resources.
Thank you, Doug. It's on KerenEldad.com, and Keren is spelled with 2 E's, the Israeli spelling.
KerenEldad.com. Again, we'll make sure that we post that in the show notes, and we'll also post in the show notes all the ways to reach Keren through social media and all the different platforms as well. We'll be back in just one click, so stay curious, my friends. Stay curious, and we'll see you in one click.